And my advertisement, I'm Graham Young, I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Progress. And I guess that's probably why they asked me to chair this session. Why the Institute for Progress? Well, A, who could be against it? Who in this room in particular could be against it? But I'm sick and tired of the so-called progressives hijacking it for nefarious purposes. So this isn't just a contest of ideas, we're in a contest of rhetoric. And calling ourselves the Institute for Progress underlines what we're in favour of. And what's more, there's hardly an Australian city or even a suburb that doesn't have a progress association. If you think of those progress associations, it's all about the things we're about. It's about people getting out there and doing things for themselves, not waiting for government to come along and do it for them. I also, and the Institute also publishes online opinion, which is one of the few marketplaces for ideas on the internet. We're not left and we're not right, but only a right-wing organisation is capable of publishing such a document. So two of our speakers have been published. Mikayla, for quite a long time, I've watched her develop as a writer and a thinker for probably 10 years, something like that. And Michael more recently, and he's got quite an interesting piece up there with Alex Sanchez, who doesn't quite share our views, but they've looked at the issue of taxation and the Federation. It's worth reading. And Duncan, the opportunity is there for you to contribute. So that's my quid pro quo. I'd like to introduce Mikayla. As I say, I've watched her develop for quite a long time. Are you Queensland originally?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a mark in favour. She's lending herself currently to people in the southern states, most notably in the most southern state that counts, Victoria. She's with the Institute of Public Affairs, which is an organisation which started off, I think, as being pro-protectionist, certainly funded by industrialists in Victoria, but is probably the leading, I think, Libertarian think tank in Australia, and Mikayla is one of the leading thinkers in that think tank. So, Mikayla.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you for a second year running. Arguably the most important intellectual, philosophical and political controversy in the world today concerns most notably how income or wealth, but also goods, social status or opportunities should be distributed across populations. So in simpler terms, we're asking ourselves, how should one deal with the inequality question? And there are generally two opposing views on the matter. First of all, as you would be acutely aware, we have Thomas Piketty, on one hand, who expresses a concern about changes in the numerical distribution of income and wealth in the long run, and more to the point, there's concern about a skew in the distribution of income or wealth towards those who are perceived to be wealthy by way of income or assets. So what is his broad solution? His broad solution is, and I quote from his very voluminous book, Capital in the 21st Century, the ideal policy for avoiding an endless inegalitarian spiral and regaining control over the dynamics of accumulation, that is, of wealth, income or capital, would be a progressive tax. He specifically argues for a global progressive tax on capital. There are two views though. Deirdre McCloskey, a good friend to us in Australia, suggests something else altogether. She says as follows: what we should not do is focus on inequality. Ethically speaking, she says, the true liberal should care only about whether the poorest among us are moving closer to having enough to live with dignity. So what this suggests here is that there is an acute debate between proponents of changing relative inequality versus a reduction in absolute poverty. Piketty being a protagonist of the former, Deirdre McCloskey the latter. Now, in my humble opinion, McCloskey has many issues going in her favour when prosecuting the view that liberals, libertarians should focus upon poverty reduction. One of these is the underappreciated point, even by self-avowed classical liberals and libertarians, is that concern for improving the economic and social conditions experienced by the poor have actually represented a foundation of classical liberal philosophy and advocacy through the ages. Consider, Adam Smith believed that society cannot flourish when the bulk of its members are poor and miserable, and he castigated the mercantile system of privileges for keeping the poor downtrodden. Richard Cobden is liberalism's all-time most effective political activist, and he railed against what he called the legislative murder, right, of tariffs, maintaining the populace in absolute want. His quote. The unfairly maligned Herbert Spencer was a strong advocate for non-state charitable works, and he delighted in how market processors realised a cornucopia of cheap, abundant goods for the masses. Even the anarcho-capitalist libertarian Murray Rothbard devoted multiple pages, in fact chapters, for example in his book, For a New Liberty, describing how statist interventions harm the poor. We want to ask ourselves, has the poor been uplifted in Australia? And I want to bring together marshal some evidence to suggest yes. So here we have from Andrew Lee's recent book, no less, Battlers and Billionaires, data from, long-run data from the ABS from the mid-1970s to 2010 in terms of wages for workers, essentially stratified by deciles. So the bottom 10%, their wages have increased over that period, mid-70s to 2010 by 15%, the bottom 25% by 23%, and so it goes. Now, to reinforce the basic point here is that a Treasury study in 2013 analysed real household. Now, there's a difference here. Here we're looking at individual wages. Now I want to refer to household income growth. A Treasury study found that by quintile, covering the period 1994-95 to 2011-12, that income for the lowest quintile households grew even faster than what is suggested here, by more than 45%, largely over the period of the Great Moderation. And that those in the second and third quintiles, well, their incomes rose by between 50 and 60%. Now, it should also be acknowledged that poor Australians do not necessarily remain poor, given the prospects for some upward mobility, even in a hampered market economy such as ours. The OECD estimated, for example, an intergenerational earnings elasticity for Australia is 0.16, compared to 0.47 for the United States. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, essentially, an elasticity figure closer to zero denotes greater intergenerational mobility. So, comparatively speaking, there is relatively high levels of upward mobility in Australian society, and this, from a classical liberal perspective, should be applauded. I'll also point to some short-run data about upward mobility revealed by longitudinal data by Hilda that is maintained by University of Melbourne. It found that 43% of people in the lowest pentile, that's the lowest fifth of income distribution, in 2001-03, progressed into a higher pentile in 2004-05. So there is even some evidence of short-run income mobility up the scale over time. We want to be thinking also, when we're thinking about living standards for the Australian poor, we want to be thinking about issues such as education status, so education health status. Here, what we have here, some data with regards to life expectancy of people living in disadvantaged areas as assessed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics for New South Wales and Victoria. So there has been an increase in life expectancy at birth in the poorest localities in those two large states. This must be good, right? Furthermore, we can look at mortality rates as well. For instance, the rate of death from cardiovascular diseases for working age men in disadvantaged areas has halved since the mid-1980s. And as you can see from this chart, there is quite a appreciable decline in mortality rates for those people living in the most disadvantaged areas in this graph here across the country. Again, a good thing that classical liberals and libertarians ought to applaud. What about educational attainment? Well, there has been an absolute rapid increase in the numbers of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds enrolling in higher educational institutions. And in fact, this chart here, which is only tracks back to 1993, understates the matter because in the early 1970s, there were only a few thousand. There are only a few thousand people enrolled in higher educational institutions from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So, such developments have been facilitated by several factors, including greater demand for human capital investments, and also easier access for higher educational institutions. Think here, income contingent loans. And so confirming this basic proposition, the education academic Gary Marks and colleague found that by 2001, the children of manual workers born in the 1970s had nearly five times the higher educational attainment of those children of manual workers born in the 1950s. There is growing educational opportunity in a growing market-based economy. This should be applauded by liberals, and these are the kinds of arguments that we should be prosecuting in the inequality/poverty debate. Let me go further. Let's think about consumption spending by those on lower incomes. A sizable increase, at least since the mid-1990s. Consumption spending by the poor has risen, but it's important to recognise that the composition of goods consumed by the Australian poor have changed substantially over time. In his famed work, The Constitution of Liberty, Hayek described a process in which goods, formerly the preserve of the wealthy, could eventually become more accessible to the masses, thanks to market competition and innovation. Let me provide a few examples. In the mid-1950s, 40% of all households owned a washing machine. By the late 1990s, 93% of households in the most disadvantaged areas owned a washing machine. In the early 1960s, 55% of all households in this country owned a television. By the 1990s, about half of all households in the most disadvantaged areas owned a television. In the early 1990s, 26% of all households owned a personal computer. By the late 1990s, just short of a decade later, 44%, so it's a doubling. 44% of households with incomes less than $50,000 owned a computer. About 23% of households with incomes up to $44,000 had home internet access in 1998. By 2013, 57%, doubling again, of households with incomes less than $40,000 had home internet access. By now, virtually all poor households in Australia have a washing machine, a television, a computer, and internet access at home, just as the rich do, and everything else in between. This is a good thing. The long-run improvement in the capacity of the poor to consume has been affected not only by the astounding product varieties on offer, but in many cases, the increasing affordability of consumables. Using methods originally employed by Michael Cox and Richard Alm, and later by Don Boudreau and Stephen Horwitz, I estimate how many hours it takes for an income-earning employee in the bottom decile of the income distribution to purchase selected items. And yes, I can pick dozens more. And what I want to do here is open up a new font in the minimum wage debate. Why does the government need to mandate a minimum wage rate, say, when the affordability of most products have radically improved? I ask. And if anything, I'll go even further. The political class, in my view, should step aside and simply allow entrepreneurs to cooperate more effectively with their customers, including the presently high-cost areas such as childcare, education, electricity, health, and housing. So we do need to address some elephants in the room. And most certainly from a liberal, a libertarian perspective, the objections to the welfare state and the minimum wage system, public health and so on, which are typically nominated by our adversaries as underpinning the living standards of the poor, can be addressed in several ways. I don't need to belabor the points. I want to suggest, though, at the very best, following an insight from Tom Palmer, that the state capacity to reallocate and redistribute depends upon the generation of surpluses by the private sector in the first place. In other words, a strong economy. And that's really the best case argument you can make. I would actually go further to say, at worst, the political loyalty programs of government interventions, such as mandated wages and redistributive subsidies, stultifies economic and social mobility. It keeps the poor in their place, and it prevents dynamic, competitive challenge to existing economic insiders who maintain their status either through fair, that is, market-tested betterment, or foul, that is, rent-seeking and influence-peddling methods. What is needed to help keep lifting up the poor? A good dose of more economic freedom. So I cite here a number of studies, and I'll certainly provide the presentation publicly at some point for you to inspect. Though they're all of the theme which suggests that relatively greater economic freedom suppresses income inequality that the likes of Piketty are concerned about, and very importantly, it promotes the employment outcomes that facilitate upward mobility. And this is vitally important. We want to emancipate cooperative economic relations. Now, the rhetoric I'm using here is drawn from Paul Rubin, who wrote an amazing paper about market emporiophobia. That is the distaste for market relationships. So we want to emancipate cooperative economic relationships between people. Because why? Because it will erode the corruption, the cronyism, and the privileges which block mobility. And mobility is the watchword, I think, for a classical liberal and a libertarian when it comes to these debates. In summary, we want to enable the poor to join the ranks of the rich. We don't want to impoverish everyone under certain regimes of regulation or highly redistributed taxes. We want to enable the poor to join the ranks of the rich through the means of market-tested betterment. This is the way forward. The evidence, I think, very compellingly points to improving living standards enjoyed by lower-income Australians over time, and I can be able to display and demonstrate that evidence across a wide range of indicators. Now, upward mobility rates are relatively high in Australia compared with other countries, but we can suggest that the rates can be vastly improved, and the very low absolute poverty rates that we have today can be even further reduced. Now, I'm thinking about absolute poverty. I'm thinking perhaps the 6,000 Australians who sleep rough in our streets every night. Now, that is our incantation of absolute poverty. Those absolute poverty rates can be greatly reduced by unleashing greater civil and market societal cooperation. For example, by obliterating planning and land use laws. I would suggest to you finally that true liberals, we actually care more about the poor because we believe in equality before the law for all. No status privileges. And we aspire for every unique human being gracing the face of this earth to discover their own modes of improvement and fulfilment without coercion, oppression, overlordship, paternalism, and privilege. We don't want to outsource compassion to the state, nor, would I humbly argue, nor should we want to outsource our compassion to our intellectual and philosophical adversaries. And I would like to think that this piece makes a small contribution to the hard task ahead. Thank you very much for your time.